The auctioneer's voice cracked through the dust like a whip over dry hay. Lot number 47. 1974 International Harvester 715 combine. Condition, inoperable. Starting bid, $200. Nobody raised a paddle. I stood at the back of the crowd with my cap pulled low, feeling the October sun press against my neck like a warm hand. The county fairgrounds smelled like diesel fuel and fried dough, and that particular kind of desperation that hangs in the air when people sell things they never wanted to let go of. I could hear the flag on the pole above the 4-H building snapping in the breeze, and somewhere behind the cattle barn, a child was laughing at something I couldn't see. $200. That was all they were asking, and still nobody moved. My name is Ethan Miller. I am 34 years old, and I have been farming the same 160 acres my father farmed before he died. The same dirt his father broke with horses back when the world was simpler and men didn't need GPS to find their own fence lines. That October morning, I was exactly 19 days away from losing every single one of those acres. The bank had made that perfectly clear in a letter that arrived on cream-colored paper with a logo embossed in gold. 19 days. After that, the land, the same land where I took my first steps, where my mother planted zinnias along the driveway, where my father taught me to read the weather by the way the leaves turned on the cottonwood trees. That land would go to auction, just like the machines lined up on this fairground grass. The auctioneer tried again. 150. Do I hear 150 for this classic piece of American engineering? A man 2 rows ahead of me laughed. Not a quiet laugh. The kind that carries and is meant to carry. That was Dale Sorensen, who owned the equipment dealership on Route 9, the place with the giant green tractor on a pole out front, and the sign that said, New Iron, New Era. He leaned over to his buddy and said something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the word scrap and the word firewood, and both of them shook with laughter until their shoulders touched. I looked at the combine. She was sitting at the far end of the lot, away from the newer machines, like they were embarrassed to be seen near her. Rust had eaten through the lower panels in patches that looked like maps of countries nobody had discovered. The header was bent at an angle that made her look like she was frowning at the ground. One tire was flat. The paint, what was left of it, had faded from red to a color that reminded me of dried blood on a barn floor after a difficult calving. But I noticed something else. The frame was solid, not cracked, not welded, not patched with sheet metal the way you see on machines that have been crashed and cobbled back together. Solid. The kind of solid they built into things back when factories cared about what came out the other end of the line. And the tires, even the flat one, they were narrow. Narrower than anything they put on modern combines. That meant less ground pressure, less weight per square inch. That meant she could walk across soft soil where a heavier machine would sink to its axles and sit there until somebody brought a dozer to pull it out. My father would have noticed that. He always said the old machines had a conversation with the ground. The new ones just shouted at it. $100, the auctioneer said, and there was a note of pity in his voice now. $100. Anyone? Last chance. I raised my paddle. The auctioneer blinked like a man who had just seen a dog walk in on its hind legs. Sold, he said, recovering. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $100. I felt the silence before I heard the whispers. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward me like sunflowers, tracking something that was definitely not the sun. Dale Sorensen said it loudest. He didn't whisper. Dale never whispered when he could announce. He said, "Well, boys, looks like Ethan Miller found himself $100 coffin for his farm. That's about right, ain't it? waste money on junk right up until the end. The laughter followed me all the way to my truck, and it was still ringing in my ears when I signed the receipt and pocketed the title. I towed the combine home that afternoon behind my pickup. The whole way down County Road 12, I could feel the weight of her pulling against the hitch like a tired animal that didn't want to be moved. Gravel popped under my tires. The chain groaned on every hill. Twice, I had to stop and tighten the straps because the combine kept shifting, leaning left like she was trying to look back at where she came from. I backed her into the space between the machine shed and the old grain bin where my father used to park his equipment, the same spot where his John Deere 4020 sat for 30 years until I sold it to pay off a medical bill I never asked for. When I killed the engine and stepped out, the silence was enormous. Just the wind moving through the standing wheat, making that sound that is halfway between a whisper and a sigh, and the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. I walked around the combine slowly, the way you walk around a horse you don't know yet. I ran my hand along the frame and felt the cold metal bite into my skin. There was a smell coming off her. Old grease, oxidized steel, mouse droppings, and something sweet underneath all of it, like the memory of grain dust, like the ghost of 1,000 harvests that had passed through her belly. I crouched down and looked at the undercarriage. The chains were seized, every link frozen with years of corrosion. The auger was locked tight with grime the color and consistency of tar. The engine, when I pulled the cover, was a monument to neglect. Corroded wires tangled like dead vines, a cracked manifold, mouse nests packed into every cavity like cotton insulation. A wasp had built a paper cathedral in the air cleaner housing, but the block was good. I tapped it with a wrench and listened the way my father taught me to listen, with my eyes closed and my breath held, the way you listen for a heartbeat. Solid. No hollow ring, no spiderweb cracks, no dull thud of a casting that had given up. My father used to say that you could tell the soul of a machine by the sound it made when you knocked on its bones. If it rang clear, there was life in it. If it thudded dull, it was already dead, and no amount of money or wishing could bring it back. This one rang clear. I worked on that combine for the next 11 days. I did not sleep much. I could not afford to, not with 19 days turning into 8, then 5, then 3. Every morning I woke at 4:30 before the sun had even thought about the horizon, and I walked out to her with a coffee mug in one hand and a wrench in the other, and the stars still hanging overhead like somebody had scattered salt across black velvet. I rebuilt the carburetor with parts I salvaged from a dead tractor in my father's workshop, the workshop he kept so organized that I could still find a 1/2-inch socket in the third drawer from the left, right where he put it the last time he used it, 7 years after his funeral. I freed the chains with penetrating oil and a sledgehammer, link by link, working each one back and forth until my arms burned from shoulder to wrist and my knuckles bled through the electrical tape I wrapped around them. I rewired the ignition with wire I pulled from an old fence charger that hadn't been used since the cattle were sold. I patched the flat tire with a plug kit and a bicycle pump because I couldn't afford a new one, and because my father would have said a man who can't fix a tire has no business fixing anything else. The header took 3 days alone. I straightened the sickle bar with a jack and a length of railroad rail I used as an anvil. I sharpened every guard by hand with a file, sitting on an overturned bucket in the fading light, the file singing against the metal in a rhythm that sounded like a hymn I half remembered from childhood. Some nights, I sat on the platform of that combine and talked to her. I know how that sounds. A grown man sitting in the dark talking to a machine with his hands cracked and black with grease and his boots caked in mud. But when you're 3 days from losing everything your family built across 3 generations, and the only thing standing between you and the end is a 50-year-old piece of equipment that everybody in the county thinks is a joke. You talk to whatever will listen. I said, I don't know if you've got anything left in you, but I've got nothing left either. So maybe that makes us even. Maybe that's enough to start with. The night I finally turned the key, my hand was shaking so badly I could hear my knuckle tapping against the ignition housing. I had cleaned the fuel lines, drained the old diesel that came out the color of coffee, poured in fresh. I had gapped the injectors one by one, holding each to the light to check the spray pattern, the way my father showed me when I was 12 years old and small enough to sit on his lap while he worked. I had bled the air from the system and primed the pump and done everything I knew how to do. And some things I had to guess at, and a few things I just closed my eyes and prayed over with the kind of prayer that doesn't use words. The engine turned. Once, slow and groaning. Twice, faster, with a cough that shook the frame. On the third try, it caught. The sound that came out of that machine was not pretty. It was a deep, ragged, coughing roar, like something waking up after a very long and troubled sleep. Black smoke poured from the exhaust in a column so thick it blotted out the stars. The whole frame shuddered and the sheet metal rattled, and somewhere in the belly of the machine something banged once, hard, like a fist hitting a table. But she ran. Lord help me, she ran. I sat in that cold metal seat with diesel fumes stinging my eyes, and I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingers went white, and I cried. Not because I was sad, not because I was scared, because for the first time in 2 years, something in my life had actually worked. Something I poured myself into had answered me back. The storm came on a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was the day the bank called to remind me I had 4 days left. The woman on the phone was polite, the way people are polite when they've already written you off. The same voice you use at a funeral when you say he looks peaceful. She said, Mr. Miller, we just wanted to confirm that the deadline is Monday, October 23rd. I said, I know. She said, Is there anything else we can help you with? I said, No, ma'am. And I hung up and stood in my kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand and looked out the window at the sky. The sky looked wrong. The clouds were the color of a bruise. Deep purple and green at the edges, stacked high like a wall coming down from the northwest. The air had that electric weight to it, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up and your teeth ache and your dog crawl under the porch and refuse to come out for any amount of coaxing. I could smell rain, not gentle rain, not the kind that farmers pray for, the soft, soaking rain that sinks into the dirt and makes things grow. This was the heavy, angry kind, the kind that tears things out of the ground instead of putting things into it. The wheat was ready. Every field in the county was standing gold and heavy, bending in the wind like a congregation bowing its head. Another week of dry weather, and we'd all be fine. But this was not going to be a week of dry weather. The storm hit at sundown and did not stop for 3 days. I have lived through bad weather my whole life. I have seen hail shred a soybean field in 20 minutes flat. I have seen tornadoes pull barns apart like they were made of balsa wood and string, but I have never, before or since, seen rain like that. It came in sheets, then walls, then what felt like solid columns of water dropping straight down from a sky that had forgotten what the color blue looked like. The creek behind my north field went from ankle deep to chest high in 6 hours. By Friday morning, County Road 12 was underwater in 3 places. By Friday afternoon, Route 9 was closed and the sheriff was on the radio telling people to stay home. By Saturday morning, The river had jumped its banks, and the bottomlands were a lake, gray and flat and still, swallowing fence posts and hay bales like they were nothing. The phone started ringing before dawn on Friday. I could hear the panic in voices I'd known my entire life, voices that had taught me things, scolded me, congratulated me, borrowed sugar from my mother, and returned it with cookies. Tom Jeffries called first. Tom farms 300 acres north of me, mostly wheat. Good man, hard worker, 3 kids in school. He said his GPS-guided combine, a brand new machine, air-conditioned cab, satellite uplink, worth more than my entire farm and everything on it, was stuck up to its cab in the low field. The tires had sunk so deep in the saturated clay that the hydraulics couldn't budge her. He said the water was rising, and he had 200 acres of wheat still standing and no way to get to it, and his voice cracked on the last word like a boy's. Then Martha Coyne called. Martha is 71, and she has farmed alone since her husband Harold passed in 2019. She grows wheat and keeps a few chickens, and she bakes the best lemon meringue pie in the county, and I am not exaggerating. She said her access road was gone, just gone, washed into the ditch like it was never there. Her wheat was on high ground, still standing, but she couldn't get a machine in, and she couldn't get the grain out. Then Ray Danforth, then the Patterson brothers, then people I barely knew, calling because someone had told someone who told someone else that Ethan Miller had a running combine, an old one, a light one that might be able to move through this mess when nothing else could. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the rain hammering the roof so hard it sounded like gravel being poured from heaven, and I looked out the window at the 715 sitting in the yard. She was streaming with water. The rust on her panels had turned dark, and in the gray morning light, she looked like something out of another century. Small and battered and impossibly old, hunched between the machine shed and the grain bin like a tired dog waiting to be told what to do. But she was light, and she was narrow, and she was running. I pulled on my boots and my father's old rain jacket, the yellow one that still hung on the hook by the back door, the one that still smelled like him even after all these years, like diesel and sweat and Copenhagen and the particular warmth of a man who worked outside in every season. And I walked out into the storm. I started with my own fields because I had to. I had 4 days to make a payment or lose my home, and the only way to make that payment was to get my wheat to the elevator. So I climbed up into that cab. No climate control, no heated seat, no GPS screen glowing green with satellite data, just a metal chair and a cracked windshield and a pair of levers, and nothing between me and the weather, but a thin roof that leaked in 2 places, and I drove into the rain. The combine moved through that soaked ground like something that remembered how to walk on water. Her narrow tires barely dimpled the surface, where a modern machine would have dug ruts 2 feet deep and sat there spinning and sinking. The 715 left tracks you could step over without breaking stride. She was slow. God, she was slow. Slower than a man walking fast. But she didn't stop. She didn't sink. She just kept cutting, the sickle bar chewing through wet wheat with a sound like tearing cloth, the auger turning, the grain flowing into the tank dark with moisture, but real and solid and worth money. I harvested my North 40 in the rain, with water running down my neck and pooling in my boots, and the wipers barely keeping up with what was coming down. I ran the south field next, feeling the ground give slightly under me in the low spots, watching the water creep across the stubble behind me like a living thing. Then, the 20 acres behind the house, working by the headlights of my pickup that I'd parked on the rise. By Friday evening, my wheat was cut. And then I kept going. Tom Jeffries was standing at the edge of his field when I pulled up, and the look on his face was something I will carry with me until I die. He was soaked to the bone, and his eyes were red, and I could tell he'd been crying, but the rain made it impossible to prove, which I think was the only reason he was standing out there instead of inside. His big combine was still in the field behind him, half submerged, listing to one side like a ship going down. The lights on the cab were still on, flickering through the water like something drowning. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. I just swung the header down and drove into his wheat. It took me all night, 12 hours in that metal seat with the rain never letting up and the engine running rough but running, always running, that coughing roar now as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Tom followed behind me in his pickup with the high beams on so I could see the rows, and twice I had to back up and find a new line because the ground was soft as pudding near the creek bed. But we got it. 300 acres. Every stalk. When I cut the last row and the header came up, Tom was standing in the rain with his hands on top of his head like a man who has just watched a miracle and doesn't know what to do with his body. He walked up to the combine and put his hand flat on the fender, and he said just 2 words, "Thank you." But he said them the way you say a prayer. By Saturday morning, my back was a single continuous line of fire, and my hands were locked into the shape of the steering wheel, the joints refusing to straighten. I drove to Martha Coyne's place next because she was 71 and alone, and because my mother, if she were alive, would have driven me there herself and waited in the truck. Martha had made coffee. She brought it out to me in a thermos, standing in the rain in a canvas jacket that was 3 sizes too big for her. Harold's jacket, I realized. And she said, "Ethan, your daddy would be proud of you. You know that, don't you?" I almost lost it right there. I drank the coffee and I drove into her field and I did not look back. Word spread the way it does in a farming community, fast and through channels that have nothing to do with cell towers or internet connections. A phone call to a cousin who tells a neighbor who drives over to tell somebody else. By Saturday afternoon, there were people lined up along the road watching me work. I could see them through the cracked windshield, men in coveralls with their arms crossed, women holding umbrellas, kids sitting on tailgates with their legs swinging. They watched the 715 roll through field after field, cutting grain that would have been lost by Monday, and nobody laughed. Nobody said the word scrap. Nobody mentioned firewood. Dale Sorensen showed up around 4 o'clock on Saturday. I saw his truck first. That big white Ram with the dealership logo on the door. New iron. New era. He parked at the edge of Ray Danforth's field and stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching for what must have been an hour. He didn't laugh. He didn't say anything to anybody. He just watched. I kept cutting. Saturday night into Sunday was the worst of it. The rain came heavier. The wind shifted and picked up, and a section of field edge along the Patterson Place collapsed into the drainage ditch like a shelf of ice breaking off a glacier. I felt the ground shift under the combine, a sickening sideways drop that threw me against the door, and my stomach fell through the floor. And for one terrible second, I was certain she was going over. I could see the black water in the ditch below, swirling with debris, and I thought, this is where it ends. This is where we both go down. But I turned the wheel hard left and gave her everything she had, full throttle, and the old engine screamed and the tires grabbed something solid underneath the mud, and she clawed her way back onto flat ground like a stubborn old mule that had not been told she was allowed to quit. The Patterson brothers were standing at the end of that field when I pulled through. Both of them, Carl and Danny, reaching up to shake my hand before I'd even killed the engine. Carl Patterson, who is not a man given to sentiment, who once set his own broken finger with duct tape and a popsicle stick, looked me in the eye and said, "That machine doesn't know it's supposed to be dead." I looked at him through the rain running down my face, and I said, "Neither do I." By Sunday morning, I had harvested 7 farms, 7 families that would have lost everything, a year's income, their bank payments, in some cases their land itself. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, quitting as suddenly as it had started, as if the sky had simply run out of anger. And as the sun came up, the first sun in 3 days, weak and pale and tentative, like it wasn't sure it was welcome, I was driving the 715 back down County Road 12 toward home. The road was a disaster. Mud and gravel and broken branches and standing water everywhere. The ditches still running full. But people were out. They were standing in their yards, standing at the end of their driveways, standing on the shoulder of the road in their boots and bathrobes and work jackets. And as I came by, slow and loud, trailing mud, the engine coughing its familiar ragged song, they did something I will never forget as long as I draw breath. They waved. Not the casual wave you give a neighbor driving past on a Tuesday. This was different. This was people standing in the early morning light with their hands raised high, some of them clapping, some of them holding signs that must have been made in the middle of the night with whatever paint they could find. One said, "Thank you, Ethan." Another said, "God bless the 715, and one, held by Martha Coyne's granddaughter, a girl of about 7 with blonde braids and rain boots covered in mud, simply said, "Hero." I could not see very well by then because my eyes were blurring, and I told myself it was the diesel fumes, and I did not stop to argue with myself about whether that was true. Monday morning I drove to the grain elevator and sold my wheat. The price was discounted for moisture. 15% dock, the elevator manager said with an apologetic shrug. But there was a lot of it, and when the scale ticket printed out, the number was enough. More than enough. Enough to make the bank payment with $300 to spare, and enough to buy seed for the spring. I made the call from the elevator parking lot. The same polite woman answered. I gave her the payment number and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Congratulations, Mr. Miller." And for the first time, she sounded like she meant it. But that was only part of it. Over the next 2 weeks, every farmer whose field I had cut brought me something. Tom Jeffries brought a check and said it was my harvesting fee, and when I tried to refuse, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't you dare, Ethan Miller. Don't you dare insult what you did." Martha Coyne brought a lemon meringue pie and an envelope, and inside the envelope was a card in her careful handwriting that said, "Your machine saved my farm. Now I can leave something to my grandchildren. Harold would have shaken your hand." Ray Danforth showed up with a flatbed truck loaded with parts, filters, belts, hoses, hydraulic fittings, all brand new, still in the boxes, and said they were for the 715 because Lord knows she had earned them, and then some. The Patterson brothers brought something else entirely. They brought a petition, 42 signatures from farmers across the county, addressed to the State Agricultural Museum, requesting that the 1974 International Harvester, 715 combined belonging to Ethan Miller, be recognized as a machine of historical and community significance. I read that petition standing in my driveway, with the autumn sun warm on my face, and my hands shook so badly the paper rattled like a leaf in the wind. Dale Sorensen came by on a Tuesday evening, about 10 days after the storm. I was in the machine shed, changing the oil on the 715. The old oil came out black and thick and smelling like it had been through a war, which I suppose it had. I heard his truck pull up on the gravel outside. He stood in the doorway of the shed for a long time, before he said anything. The light was behind him, and I couldn't see his face. Then he said, "Ethan, I owe you an apology." He said, "I laughed at you, and I laughed at that machine, and I was wrong on both counts." He said, "You did something last week that not one of my brand new machines could have done, and I have been selling equipment for 25 years, and I have never seen anything like what I saw in those fields." I wiped my hands on a rag, and I looked at him and I said, "She just needed someone to believe in her. That's all." He was quiet for a minute, then he nodded, slow, like a man who has just learned something he should have known a long time ago. And he said, "Maybe we all do. The farm is still mine. It will always be mine now." The wheat came in strong the following spring, and the spring after that, and the 715 is still parked between the machine shed and the grain bin, right where I put her the day I brought her home from that auction. She leaks oil, a slow, steady drip that has stained the concrete beneath her in a dark circle that looks like a shadow. The cab rattles when you hit second gear. The paint is still that same faded color, the color of dried blood and old rust, and a life lived entirely outdoors. And I have no intention of changing it, not ever. Sometimes in the evening, after the work is done and the light goes gold and the sun drops behind the far tree line, I walk out and put my hand on her frame. The metal is warm from the day's heat, and if you stand very still and listen with your whole body, the way my father taught me to listen, you can feel it. A hum, low and steady, like a heartbeat you have to be very quiet to hear. People drive by sometimes and slow down to look at her. Some of them take pictures. The story got around, the way stories do in small towns where everybody knows which field belongs to whom and which dog bit the mailman in 2014. And it grew in the telling, as stories always do. But the truth is enough. The truth is more than enough. $100. One broken machine. One storm that tried to take everything. And one farmer who had nothing left to lose, except the stubborn, irrational, completely unjustifiable belief that something everybody else had given up on might still have a little life left in it. My father used to say that the measure of a man is not what he holds on to when things are going well. It is what he refuses to let go of when things are going bad. I think about that every time I look at the 715. I think about the rain and the mud and the sound of her engine coughing back to life in the dark. I think about Tom Jeffries standing in his flooded field with his hands on his head. I think about Martha Coyne in Harold's old jacket, holding out a thermos of coffee like it was communion. I think about Carl Patterson saying, "That machine doesn't know it's supposed to be dead." And I think about this. Sometimes the thing that saves you is not the newest, not the biggest, not the most expensive. Sometimes it is the one rusted, dented, forgotten thing that everyone else walked past, the one that was waiting there all along, patient and quiet, for someone stubborn enough to give it one more chance. That is the story of the last harvest. That is the story of the 715. And if you take nothing else away from it, take this. Never laugh at someone else's $100 bet. You don't know what they can see that you can't, and you never will until the storm comes.